Well, welcome everybody this afternoon. This is a ceremonial session of the Wake County Superior Court to honor some very special attorneys who have recently passed away. I'm Judge Howard Manning Jr. and Judge Stevens asked me to preside over this special occasion this afternoon. I want to thank the Wake County Bar Association and its Memorials Committee for sponsoring this event. We have come together this afternoon to honor the following deceased members of the Wake County Bar: Jane S. Atkins, Joe Hambrick Kittner, Armistead Jones Maupin, William F. O'Connell, and William Gale Parker. We gather here today to honor each of them and to pay tribute to them and bear witness as to how they touched and enriched the lives of others through their service to the legal profession and to the community. And again, this is not a sad occasion. It's not meant to be a sad occasion. This is just a time to reflect and remember, a time to honor their memories and contributions that will enrich each of us in a celebration of the lives of these former members. I now recognize George G. Hearn, past president of the Wake County Bar Association, for his remarks. Mr. Hearn.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. I'm George Hearn, and I take great pleasure in welcoming you to this memorial service on behalf of the 3,649, as of today, members of the 10th Judicial District Bar, those lawyers who live or work and practice in Wake County. With the permission and sponsorship of this honorable court, this service has been organized by the Memorials Committee of the 10th Judicial District Bar, ably chaired by Leonard T. Jernigan, Jr. We are indebted to this committee for maintaining this memorial tradition, and this is one of the most important traditions and activities that we undertake each year. The names of the committee members are in your program, but I would ask them to stand now to be recognized and for us to show our appreciation. Members of the committee, thank you. I want to say a special tribute to the presenters today who have volunteered to bring to you their reflections and reminiscences about the individuals we remember today. Their names also are in the program. We gather today to recall our friends and fellow lawyers. They traveled different paths but shared with us and each other the bonds as Wake County lawyers. Today we will reminisce and grieve and perhaps laugh as we recall the joy that these our departed colleagues brought to us and brought to others during their lives and careers. Above all, we gather in the presence of their family and their friends to pay respect to their memories and to honor their distinguished careers and to honor their service to us and to their fellow citizens. We give thanks for all that they have meant to us and for the heritage that we will cherish for many years. Thank you, Your Honor, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Hearn, and I now recognize Leonard T. Jernigan, Jr., Chairman of the Memorials Committee, and he will present the program.
Thank you, Your Honor. Also want to thank you for coming. I just want to say it's a real pleasure on behalf of the Memorials Committee to put this together, and we've worked hard and hope you enjoy the presentations. And I'm going to introduce the speakers as they come up. And Meredith McGill is originally from Kings Mountain, North Carolina. She is a graduate of Appalachian State University and got her law degree from Wake Forest University School of Law. She's practiced family law for the past 20 years. She was a great friend of Jane Atkins, and she's going to honor her today.
Good afternoon. Jane Cisco Atkins was born in Asheville, North Carolina in March of 1947, the child of Dr. Stanley Atkins and Elizabeth Schaefer Atkins. Jane was one of 3 children, having a brother Bill and a sister Pat. Jane graduated from Asheville High School. During her childhood, Jane was very adventurous and active, excelling at water skiing at her family's summer home at Lake Fontana. Jane went to UNC Greensboro and then transferred to Chapel Hill in her sophomore year because at that time Chapel Hill didn't allow women in as freshmen. At Chapel Hill, Jane majored in elementary education. However, after one semester of student teaching, she decided this was not the career for her. So she continued her education at Wake Forest University Law School. She received her Juris Doctorate in 1974 at a time when few women attended law school. After graduation, Jane worked with the state of North Carolina, representing both the ABC Board and the North Carolina Utilities Commission. She then moved into private practice with the firm of Monroe, Wine, Atkins, and Lennon, where she became a partner. During her years at Monroe Wine, Jane began her family law practice, and in 1992, she established her own practice. In 1995, she obtained her specialization certification in family law. From the beginning of her career as an attorney, Jane was very active in her community. She believed that this was part of her responsibility as an attorney to the community, and Jane had a lot to offer. Jane worked many years with the North Carolina Democratic Party. She was a member of the board at the Women's Center and also on the board at the North Carolina Symphony. She further provided her services to an organization known as FIGS, which stands for Filling in the Gaps, to provide prescription medication for low-income persons. In terms of her professional associations, Jane was a member of the North Carolina Bar Association, both the family law and the mediation sections, and the North Carolina Academy of Trial Lawyers, where she chaired the family law section in 2001 and 2002. Jane was also chairperson of the District Court Committee of the Dispute Resolution section. I met Jane in family law practice, where we sometimes had cases together and sometimes just chatted about our practices. Family law, as many of you know, is an area that requires a combination of emotional intelligence, empathy, and strong advocacy skills on the practitioner's part. Also a lot of patience. Perhaps Jane went into family law at the beginning because she was handed those cases by her partners. However, she excelled in that practice because she was well suited to its demands. Jane took her professional responsibility very seriously, in that she was dedicated to her clients and to quality work. She was always thoroughly prepared and was a fierce advocate for her clients. She educated herself on ancillary issues such as tax and real property and other issues that were part of family law so she could effectively represent her clients. Well ahead of the curve, Jane was one of the first attorneys to recognize the value of mediation in resolving disputes. She trained as a mediator and was certified by the Administrative Office of the Courts as a Superior Court mediator. In this capacity, Jane traveled all over the state, acting as a mediator in a variety of cases, including construction, contract, and personal injury. She was one of the first attorneys in Wake County in the family law context to utilize mediation, and she recognized truly that where families are concerned, mediation is generally a superior method of dispute resolution instead of litigation. One of the clients Jane represented had this to say about her. Jane was a counselor's counselor. She cared not only about her client's legal issues, but also about the client's well-being. When Jane helped me negotiate a contract, she first found out what values were important to me, and she addressed those in the language of the contract. She was very gracious and supportive, and always thinking, a very bright person. Another client for whom Jane drafted a premarital agreement indicates that this was a very difficult document for he and his prospective spouse to consider. However, Jane was able to help them navigate this potentially troublesome situation through her patient explanation and careful drafting. I've told you a little bit about Jane Atkins as an attorney, just the outline of her professional life. Let me tell you a little bit more about her. All of us know those continuing legal education programs about professional responsibility, the ones that try to inspire us to a higher standard of practice. Well, Jane Atkins represented the best of the qualities that make a good attorney. She was a professional who saw her duty go way beyond advocacy. She was a true counselor at law who saw outside the narrowness of one position and understood the greater picture. Jane was a person of high integrity. You could count on what she told you, and every lawyer and every judge knew this about her. In a profession where much is superficial, where posturing is part of the character of many attorneys, Jane was real and genuine. She really cared about her clients, their problems, their families, their wishes, and their needs. I'm fortunate in that I also came to know Jane as a friend. So I can say that in her personal life, Jane also had high standards. She married the love of her life, Lewis Crawley, in 1993. And she and Lewis made a happy life together with their Doberman, Lance. Lewis and Jane purchased a beach home at Emerald Isle, at which they spent many happy weekends. Jane really loved the beach, watching the ocean, walking on the beach, watching wildlife from the big picture window in their house. Last July 4th, Jane was at the beach on jet skis. Lewis and Jane also traveled through the United States and abroad, enjoying their time together and away from the demands of their work. Part of what we lawyers are struggling with in our profession is called quality of life. Jane Atkins had a very high quality of life. This was a journey for her, as it is for many of us, how to balance our professional obligations and our personal lives. Jane was always learning and growing, and because she was open to growth, she did achieve balance in her life. When she was diagnosed with cancer, she did not let her illness define her. Yet she learned from the illness itself and from other survivors. Jane gained new perspective and rearranged her priorities. She learned to live in the moment, to enjoy all that life has to offer. She enjoyed bridge, tennis, skiing, snow skiing, water skiing, and sailing. Jane returned to painting, which she had started as a child. Jane was a talented artist, and she has left a number of beautiful paintings as a legacy of her inner beauty. Jane embraced time with friends and family. She was particularly close to her sister Pat. She loved her stepdaughter Heather, and she was devoted to her nieces and nephews. Jane and Lewis's grandson was born this March on Jane's birthday. Jane opened herself up to others that she met through cancer support groups and expanded her circle of friends. Jane's friends will tell you that she was very generous in her friendship, loyal, and giving of her time. They will also tell you that Jane was a lot of fun. She had a great sense of humor, and this humor sustained and nurtured her and those close to her. She showed great kindness to others, and that was something that drew people to Jane. It is a testament to the depth and quality of Jane's friendship that her friends from different areas of her life have developed a bond with each other after her death. Jane grew spiritually as well during her illness. The hospice chaplain who met with Jane stated that she was the most spiritually open and mature person he'd had the privilege of working with. Those who knew Jane well saw her develop a wholeness of self that was remarkable. She was patient with others, forgiving of their quirks and their shortcomings. Jane was at peace with herself, her situation, and her maker. Although Jane was fighting cancer with its attendant difficulties for the last 5 years of her practice, she never used her illness to gain sympathy or to delay proceedings for her clients. Even when she was hospitalized, she made sure that all necessary client matters were taken care of. In 2003, Jane finally retired from practice to focus on enjoying the other parts of her life. This was not an easy decision for her to make, in that she had put so much of herself into developing that practice. It was a significant life decision and a quality of life decision for her. She had realized, as too few of us do, that work is only a part of life, not meant to consume our lives, and certainly not a measure of self-worth. As a result, she was able to put into perspective her responsibility to her clients and her responsibility to herself. Jane was an excellent lawyer and counselor, an able advocate, a leader in our community. She contributed immeasurably to her profession and her community. More than that, she was a dear friend who was always there for those who needed her. She taught us about life, what is important and meaningful. Jane Atkins set a fine example of how to practice law, how to live life, and how to embrace its end.
Thank you. Robin Hammond is a graduate of East Carolina University and UNC Chapel Hill Law School. She's currently the Real Property Counsel for North Carolina Clean Water Management. She's going to talk to us about Ms. Kittner.
Well, I'll probably cry, so I'll go ahead and say. I'm just going to tell you a few things about my friend Jo. Her favorite actress was Audrey Hepburn. And she was a lot like Audrey Hepburn. She had this cool elegance about her. And she walked into the room and she was a presence, and you knew she was there. And she was good at everything she did. She graduated from UNCG. She was an art history major. And she took a job with Belk as a fashion merchandiser. That was her first job. And then I'm not exactly sure how she made the transition to law school, but somehow she did. And she was at Carolina, and she excelled. She met her husband, David, there. They were classmates. And when she got out of law school, she went to work in Durham as a domestic attorney. And then she came to Raleigh, and we practiced law together at Hatchell and Bunn from 91 to 93 or 4, I think. And she did domestic work for us. And then she got a job as the lobbyist for the Bar Association, and she was good at that. I mean, she was great at it. And then she moved to Richmond because her husband was up there, and she got a job as a lobbyist for the Retail Merchants Association for the state of Virginia. And then the next time I heard from her, she was in-house counsel for Circuit City. I mean, she could do anything. And I think she could walk in an interview and convince them that she was the right person for the job, whether she had the background for it or not. But she just was a just very confident person and very elegant. And she had everything, so everything to her sort of boiled down to the war between the sexes. I mean, she could, any problem you gave her, she'd boil it down to male versus female, and women were always going to come out ahead. Yeah. And I think that her husband probably loved that about her and hated it about her too. And one thing I especially remember about her is one summer when we were at Hatchell and Bunn, and Philip Isley, who's on the city council, I hope he doesn't get upset with me for telling the story, but he was clerking for us that summer, and he met his wife, Laura Boyce, his future wife, and he was just in love with her. He'd come to work the next day just mooning over how much he was in love with her, and she was home for the summer, and she had a boyfriend somewhere else. And Jo gave him advice all through that summer. And lo and behold, if Laura didn't get back to school, dumped that boyfriend and married Philip. So I think Jo's advice as a marriage counselor was probably good advice too. Yeah, and I don't know what else to say about her. She was a great person, and she was a great friend. And David misses her. Thanks.
Well, John Williamson is a native of Boonville, Kentucky, and a graduate of the Naval Academy. He received his JD from Duke University and is currently chairman of the Maupin Taylor litigation section. I'm sure he's going to explain this photograph to us in some detail.
Thank you, Lenny. Judge Manning, Sheriff Harrison, family members, distinguished peers and superiors of the Wake County Bar. Everyone wants to know about the photograph, but I must ask you to wait. I'm 60 years old. I worked with the lawyer about whom I'm going to speak for 34 of the 65 years during which he was admitted to the bar. And yet, even now, it is not Armistead, it's Mr. Maupin. In part, that's a reflection of the esteem in which our senior partners were held. In part, it's simply a custom of an era that is ending with the passing of each of its members. How and why is the generation of lawyers of which Mr. Maupin was a part different from today? What shaped their careers? What made them distinct? For starters, they survived the Depression. Most of them served in World War II. They had the privilege of living in the South at a time when it was still a distinct region that had not yet been assimilated into bland uniformity or assaulted by the second Yankee invasion. When those of my era went off to war, it was for a finite 13 months. We knew on the day that we arrived in country, the day that we would be released to return home. When Mr. Maupin's era was faced with that duty, they all closed down their practices, kissed their families goodbye, and left for the duration, which for some of them was a very long 4 years. When that occurred for Mr. Maupin, it was only shortly after he had graduated from law school in 1940. So he, like the others, returned when the war was over to pick up his practice and go forward. What they found at the time was what was still a profession. Law had not started to edge toward being a business, and it in general was not a place where you expected to make a great deal of money. What you were there for was service to the people who did not have law licenses, but did have problems, and your role was to help them solve these problems. The bar was small. As you've already heard today, Wake County now has 3,600 lawyers. In Mr. Maupin's era, it was so small that one of the rites of passage for new lawyers was that they were expected to go around and personally meet each member of the Wake County Bar, and were able to do that. Legal specialties were still a rarity. You were too pleased to see a client come through the door asking for help to even think of telling him that you couldn't handle his problem. So people by necessity got to see a wide slice of life. It's particularly true for us because the front door of our offices at the time when I joined the firm in 1972, opened directly onto Davie Street. So people would walk in straight off the sidewalk looking for legal advice from time to time. We were less than half a block from the courthouse. And in Mr. Maupin's era, if you were a lawyer, you were by definition probably a trial lawyer. And you spent a large part of your time here in this courthouse or the other courthouses near Wake County. Well, that's where this photo comes in. One of our principal clients at that time was a railroad which through several mergers is now CSX Corporation. The railroad law has changed over the era just like everything else. In the origins of railroad law, if you and your automobile had a collision with a train at a crossing, you were out of court because the train was deemed to have the right-of-way and everybody knew it couldn't turn left or turn right, and so it was your fault and that was the end of the inquiry. But our friends in the Court of Appeals over time have eroded that, and it got to the point where you always had two principal issues in the case. Was the train blowing its whistle at the appropriate time? And was there an obstructed sight distance? So the plaintiff's bar, being ever creative, would come in and say, if you had just cut down these trees 50 feet further back, my client would have seen your train. You know, we're not going to talk about whether he should have heard it, but he might have seen it, and then he would have stopped, so it's your fault. So Mr. Maupin was out with the cameraman creating demonstrative evidence for one of his cases to show what the sight distance was that this, misguided motorist would have had at the crossing. And as you can see, there's no obstruction whatsoever, and the train's light is bright and visible. Regrettably, he couldn't get out of the way of the camera when the picture was taken. And for years, we had a caption underneath that in his office called "The Great Train Robbery." Mr. Maupin was in his element in the courtroom. He was a cross-examiner who could make a witness shrivel on the witness stand. Mr. Taylor, another of our senior partners, said that if he could pick just one word to describe Mr. Maupin, it would be fearless. And it was my observation that he simply had no nerves. You could hand him a file and say, Mr. Maupin, you need to try this tomorrow. And he would say, of course, and would pick it up and go into court and try it with aplomb. He was physically big, but he also had the capacity to go from calm to bluster very quickly. And that made him appear to puff up and be even larger than he was. I encountered that for the first time about a month after I joined the law firm. I was too green to know that it was unwise to discuss sensitive political issues with Mr. Maupin and Mr. Ellis at a firm party where alcohol had been served. I nonetheless undertook to do that, only to find that it was like trying to persuade Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun to be reasonable. Ellis suspected that I was a liberal subversive because I'd been to Duke, so I was on thin ice anyhow. And I left that encounter pretty shaken. I went home to my new bride and I said, honey, I don't know what we're going to do about the mortgage, but I don't think I'm going to have a job as of Monday. The other wonderful aspect of Mr. Maupin was he had a very short memory and he didn't hold grudges. And by Monday morning, he had forgotten all about it and life went on very well. In his era, the word of a lawyer was your bond. It had to be that way because with a small, tight bar, there was no way to hide your reputation or to redeem it if you lost it. Mr. Maupin would always tolerate mistakes in young lawyers because he knew we would make them, but he would never accept or tolerate any degree of dishonesty. The harshest thing he could ever say about another lawyer was that with him, you'll have to put that in writing every single time. The next harshest thing I ever heard said was actually said by Mr. Taylor about someone who shall remain nameless. Mr. Taylor said, if you ordered a whole boxcar of son of a bitches and the train stopped and only he got off, your order would have been filled. Mr. Maupin was at ease in any social setting, and as he began to permit me to handle his clients' problems, I learned that those clients range from little widow ladies who would bring farm produce to pay part of their fee with, to titans of industry. They all shared a deep faith in Armistead's advice, and I got used to them calling him up to ask whether the young fellow knew what he was doing. He was always generous enough to say yes. I think my most memorable experience in that line was when he sent me off to California to meet Ernest and Julio Gallo. They had a very important legal matter going on in North Carolina, and why he thought it was wise to send me and not tell them ahead of time that it was going to be me, I'll never figure it out. But they picked me up in a limousine and brought me to their boardroom, and I got about 5 feet through the door. One of them fixed me with his glare and says, "Where's Armistead?" And it went rather downhill from there until we get. Mr. Maupin had the blessing of being able to practice at a time when we were not yet subject to the tyranny of the timesheet. You did what was necessary to resolve your client's problems. You didn't really care too much about how much time that took, and you cared a little bit, but not all that much, about what you were going to get in the way of a fee at the end. Your guiding principle was to solve their problem. I was going through the Supreme Court reporters in our library during about my first year of practice, and discovered in that process a case that Mr. Taylor had taken to the Supreme Court twice over an absolutely paltry sum. I think it was perhaps $500. And I asked him, why in the world did you do that? And his response was, they kept getting it wrong. The fact that we weren't fixated by money enabled Mr. Maupin to carve out a balance in life with time for family, for community, and service to the bar. For him, that included the presidency of the Wake County Bar Association, the presidency of the State Bar, the chairman of the American Battlefield Monuments Commission, and the president general of the Society of the Cincinnati. He always made time for training the stream of fresh young lawyers that would come through our doors from year to year, and he continued that role right up to the year of his death, coming into the office at age 91 every single day, bright and early. We didn't have paralegals when I joined the firm, and associates for the early part of their careers were expected to carry their senior partner's briefcases and observe. I now know that I could easily win a class action on behalf of most of us to recover our law school tuition as having been absolutely wasted by comparison to what we learned by watching partners like Mr. Maupin, Mr. Taylor, Mr. Ellis, Howard Manning Sr., Joe Moore Sr., try cases in front of judges like Judge Bailey, Judge Godwin. It was a memorable experience which has shaped my legal career. It's been said that grief is the price that we pay for love. Honoring the remembrance of a life well lived replaces that grief. Mr. Maupin lived life more fully than about anyone I've ever known. He and I once, we shared a love of horses, and once over a couple of glasses of whiskey, we both observed that if we could pick our own way to go, it'd be to fly over an Irish stone wall and fetch up on the other side with a broken neck, with just enough time to reflect that we'd left nothing undone. I believe he achieved that. I'm proud to have known him. I'm a better lawyer for having been his partner, and I salute him and thank you for being here to honor him today.
Ann Reed is a native of Kinston. She graduated from Carolina undergraduate and also Carolina Law School. And she, when she finished law school, went to join the Attorney General's office, where she worked with Mr. O'Connell until his retirement in 1988. Welcome, Ann Reed.
Know we were going to have to get up here and tell our ages. It was my pleasure to spend the first 17 years of my career with Bill O'Connell as he spent the last 17 years of his career. Bill left behind a large legacy that anyone should be proud of. First of all, his family. He had 5 children he was very proud of, 4 of whom survived him. 3 of his children are here today. And he adored his wife, Georgia. Bill and Georgia were married for 57 years. They actually reminded me of that TV commercial that we see sometimes these days, the young couples walking along in a park, and they come upon this old couple who are walking along totally in sync with each other, holding hands. That was Bill and George. It just doesn't get any better than that. Another part of Bill's legacy is his enviable record of service to our country. Bill was born in Texas in 1921 and attended Austin College. As soon as he graduated, he entered the Air Force, where he served as a navigator on a B-25 bomber. His plane was actually shot down on D-Day, though not until after he had flown 5 missions. He had a case full of medals. That included the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, and the Commendation Medal. After World War II, Bill returned to Texas and went to the University of Texas School of Law for law school. He went into private practice after he graduated, but he decided to stay in the Air Force Reserves, so when the Korean War broke out, Bill was called back into active service. This time he served as a judge advocate. After the conflict in Korea ended, Bill decided to make his career with the Air Force instead of in private practice, and he eventually ended up as a judge on the Military Court of Appeals. He was a lieutenant colonel when he retired in 1971 after 29 years of service in the Air Force. At the time, he was working in Washington, D.C., where he met Robert Morgan. Senator Morgan was then the Attorney General of North Carolina, and he was a very, very wise man in his decisions of who to hire, and recognized talent when he saw it. He recognized Bill's talent and talked Bill into coming to North Carolina to be a member of the Department of Justice staff. That launched Bill into yet another part of his distinguished career, 17 years with the Attorney General's office. And that was when I first came to know Bill, because Bill and I actually started working in the Attorney General's office in the same month, September of 1971. Bill soon became the state's leading expert on mental health law, and he worked with the legislature to draft the current mental health laws. Most of you probably won't remember this. I know Andy and Senator Morgan will. But in 1971, the state of the state's mental hospitals and facilities for the mentally disabled was a disgrace. They were grossly understaffed and underfunded. The legislature was not inclined to appropriate the money, and it was a vast amount of money that was needed to fix these problems. So what happened was that the state ended up defending several huge class actions. These, I guess, were the first cases where the plaintiffs came to be known by their last initials, William and Thomas S. Now, when you hear those cases, you probably will remember another recently deceased member of the Wake County Bar, Deborah Greenblatt, because she represented the plaintiffs in those cases. And you probably remember some of the other very distinguished lawyers who represented the plaintiffs. We don't, unfortunately, sometimes, in this case, definitely, should have celebrated just as much the attorneys for the losing side in the litigation. That was Bill O'Connell, because the situation that Bill faced was a real dilemma. On the one hand, he had a very angry federal court judge who was ordering tens of millions of dollars and other relief for the plaintiffs. He also had clients who, in this case, agreed with the federal judge because they'd been trying for years to get this money and hadn't been able to. But on the other hand, Bill faced a very, very angry and in some instances hostile legislature, which wanted to know how a federal judge thought that he could run the state's mental health system and dictate to the North Carolina General Assembly from the bench in Charlotte. Bill was the consummate professional during all this time, though I'm very assured that he was very glad during that time for all of his training on those B-25s. But at any rate, he took all the flack from the plaintiffs and the client and the legislature and was always the voice of reason. His determination that the parties would work together facilitated improvements that exist today and were, at that time, incorporated into the state's mental health system. Finally, I want to take the privilege of telling you how proud I am to consider myself part of Bill's legacy. He was my mentor for many, many years, and much of what I know, both about practicing law and about being a manager, I learned from Bill. I can't even count the times that some thorny personnel or legal problem would come up, and I've thought to myself, I wonder what Bill O'Connell would say or do. Or I'll remember some of the pearls of wisdom that he would pass along to me. Things like, if you've got a really difficult problem and you need to talk to your boss about it, always remember one thing: you need to have a suggested solution when you go in there to talk to him. Don't go in there without that. And then there were Bill's. He had a very dry sense of humor, and he could come up with some analogies that I still remember. People sometimes try to put things together that don't belong together. How many of you know what a horse cow is? A horse cow is what you get when you cross a horse and a cow together, and what you end up with is an animal that you can't get milk from, and you won't win the Kentucky Derby. Now, that's something you can actually use. Anyway, I treasure my years working with Bill O'Connell. I think all of us, all of our lives, look for role models, and we're lucky if we find good ones. I was very lucky because I found a great one, and I really appreciate your letting me tell you something about him today. Thank you.
Robert McMillan is a member of our committee and very active in what we do with his service. We're delighted to have him with us today. He's a native of Raleigh and a graduate of Wake Forest University and the University of North Carolina. And he was the first recipient of the Joseph Branch Professionalism Award in Wake County. And he's speaking today in front of on behalf of Mr. Parker.
All I am, I thank Ann Reed for. Thank you. It's my great privilege today to have been asked to talk about my dear friend, William Gale Parker. It is interesting to note the names of a remarkable number of lawyers familiar to members of the Wake County Bar who were raised in relatively close proximity to Gale Parker's home in Orlando in Bertie County. Included among this list are Thad Ure, Justice J. William Copeland, Judge A. Pilston Godwin Jr., John R. Jordan Jr., Spencer Barrow, Whit Powell, Emily Copeland Cato, and Henry Manning. All of us know how clannish are the natives of that portion of the state lying to the northeast of the Roanoke River. They are justifiably proud of a great heritage. Gale Parker lived a life of nobility and honor that enhanced this heritage. Gale was born in April of 1918 on a family farm near Orlando. He was familiar with honest and rewarding toil. He was intimately acquainted with the north ends of southbound mules. Working from dark to dark was his accepted lifestyle as a youth. After graduating from Orlando High School in 1934, he entered the freshman class of Wake Forest College in the fall of that year. After 2 years at Wake Forest, he enlisted in the United States Navy in 1936, hoping to get a fleet appointment to the Naval Academy. He chose instead to attend midshipman school at Notre Dame University. Upon graduation, he was commissioned an ensign. He served with distinction thereafter throughout the remainder of his naval career, including the entire span of World War II. In 1946, he was released from active duty and remained a member of the Naval Reserve until his retirement in 1978 with the